Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I see the number of people in the audience has shrunk, which is, hopefully that's not speaking about what people think about community engagement, because as we all know, community engagement is a critically important component of mineral resource development in the province these days, because communities can certainly shut down projects, so they play a significant role in what happens in the province and mining activities. So my talk this afternoon is talking about community engagement, Chapter 2 or 2000, and I'll explain why I have that question in there. When I started to put the presentation together, I decided to go back and take a look at the prospectors' videos that have been produced recently in partnership with MANS and DNR. And I looked at the land access one, and I brought up the Nova Scotia Minerals Policy, and it was kind of interesting because this was done in 1996, which is almost 18 years ago. And if you look down at the list of questions here, or question points that they raise, it's provide greater certainty of mineral rights tenure, facilitate access to land and resources, increase public awareness of mining and the mineral industry, and encourage integrated land use planning. And these are all still 18 years later, very prevalent topics. And I'm not really sure how far advanced or how much progress we made in any one of these single issues. We're still doing a lot of work. We still haven't succeeded in putting a big check mark through these things. So that was really about the 2000 question, because we've been doing engagement for 18 years. What I'd like to talk about now is the two parts, or two chapters in the story. The first chapter in the story is the 2013 report that we released last year at the open house called the Community Consultation, a guide for prospectors and mineral exploration companies working in Nova Scotia. And this was very much a cooperative effort between MANS, Nova Scotia Department of Natural Resources, Sierra Club, and the Ecology Action Centre. It was one of the first partnerships I've really seen develop between these organizations. I think it was a very big step forward for the department and for the mining industry. It's an education guide really for prospectors and exploration companies, trying to tell you when you should be going out and contacting people in communities and who give you some idea who you should be talking to. But when I read the report, one of the concerns I thought about is that, because I've been doing a lot of work in the last few years, going out and talking to municipal councils and land use planners and CAOs for municipalities. One thing I'm concerned about is that you're going to be going out and knocking on the door, and what you're going to end up finding is that a lot of them are going to give you very puzzled stares. So you're going to see a big question mark, because most of them are quite unprepared to start engaging you. And the reason for this is that there's really two discussion obstacles that I've seen in my experience talking to these municipalities, is that there's a lack of direct contact with the mineral industry. The mineral industry is like any other industry. It goes about doing its business. It only seems to surface when you're starting to go through the permitting process. But most of the time you go out there and do your business, you keep very quiet. People don't bother you, you don't bother them. They just go about doing their business. And so a lot of the people in the communities really don't understand how the mineral industry works. And in fact, if I show them that picture on the screen, and the one on the left is an underground mining operation at the salt mine in Pugwash. The one on the right is the Martin Marietta quarry up in Port Hawkesbury. Most people in the audience in these municipalities would not be able to distinguish between the difference of two. They would basically see those as mining operations. They would see them as being run under the same policy, when in fact there's two entirely different policies in Nova Scotia that regulate those two different operations. Significant differences to the two, but they wouldn't be able to distinguish them. So when they think about mining, they also include pits and quarries in the image of the mining activities in the province. The second problem is that there's little to no exposure in the education system about geology and mineral resources. There's a small module in grade 4 that talks about earth sciences. There's a small module in grade 7, and if the schools are lucky and they have a geologist that happens to be a teacher, they'll take on teaching a geology course in grade 12. But very little exposure. And that's really a shame, because I can tell you a story a few years ago when I got invited out by Straight Highlands RDA to go around and give toolkits that were put together by Fenton Eisner to all the schools in Inverness and Richmond counties. And you go out there and they bring all the grade 4 classes in, so there might be 60 or 7 kids in the class standing around the auditorium, and I had the opportunity to talk with the rocks that were in there and a little bit about geology. And at the end of the 10-minute presentation, you ask them if they have any questions. And I swear to God, every single hand in that room went up and wanted to ask a question about geology. So at grade 4 level, people are very engaged in geology. And I don't think that goes away, because if you look and go out and walk on a beach and you see people walking up the beach on a rocky beach, people are always picking up rocks and looking at them. And I think that is still there ingrained in people, but it's kind of like when I went to a presentation up in Antigonish County to the municipal council, and the person that went ahead of me was actually talking about the Gaelic language. What happened in the Gaelic language at Cape Breton, what's kind of surprising to me, there was about 70 or 80, I think it was 70% of people originally in Cape Breton spoke Gaelic. But when they started going to school, they weren't allowed to speak Gaelic in school. And so they eventually, over time, they lost it. And geology is kind of a lot like that, because they get exposed to it in the early stages of their life, but then it doesn't really talk about the rest of their school curriculum. And so what happens is when they graduate school, they go out into the world, they have no experience in geology. So they really don't understand the basics of geology and the basics of mineral exploration to start engaging you in a meaningful manner. That's a big barrier to these kinds of discussions. So what does it end up meaning? What happens when that happens? Well, because many of these people out in these municipalities don't understand geology, they don't understand the mineral resource industry, they can't really have fact-based discussions when they start to be engaged with their local people in their communities. It becomes very emotion-based discussions that sometimes are based on a lot of misinformation. And so the pendulum right now is very much pushed towards emotion-based discussions, and those are the most dangerous discussions for the mineral industry, because you can't have reasonable dialogue in that kind of scenario. So this is kind of the next step. This is kind of chapter 2 for us, because after we did this, we worked on producing a new document. And it's called the Guidebook for Use in the Assessment of Mineral Exploration Benefits and Impacts on Communities. It's focused on prospecting through advanced exploration, and the reason for this is because, first of all, a lot of the activity that happens in the province is at the exploration stage. And secondly, by the time you reach the mining stage on the right, you should have very well-established community engagement programs in place. If you don't, you're probably going to be dead in the water. That's the reason we focused on the exploration. It has 5 sections. It's broken open into 5 sections in the document. Number 1 is a questionnaire. Number 2 are benefit and impact risk tables. Number 3 is a mining cycle or sequence. Number 4 is a glossary of technical terms. And number 5 is common questions and answers. Number 1 and 2 are really the key sections of the document that communities need to start to use to analyze the impacts and benefits. Number 3, 4, and 5 are really educational components that we added into the back just to give some basic instruction on some of the terms that are used in the questionnaire and in the benefit and impact risk tables. So you might be sitting there, why a questionnaire? Well, first of all, it comes back to that challenge with the education, the fact that most people don't know about the mineral industry and they don't know about geology. So if you don't know about either one of those and you're sitting across the table from somebody that's very experienced in the mineral industry, you're not even going to know the basic questions to ask them to collect the key information that they need to do a risk and benefit analysis. So it captures that key information, and then it's a hard document so that if the municipal councillor gets questioned by one of his residents, then he can pull out that document, go back to it, he can look at the question and say, oh yeah, they explained what they were doing in this situation. So they're basing the information on facts. They're looking at factual information provided by the company. That will hopefully eliminate a lot of the rumors and misinformation that circulates around these projects when they're starting to undertake the exploration and development in the communities. And it should hopefully make a big move towards building trust. This is just an example. The first 3 questions, very straightforward questions. Do you own the mineral rights for the area you plan to explore? Yes or no? I'm not going to read through all these things, but there's a whole series of questions. There's, I think, 3 pages of questions in the document that just ask very simple information, and it gets documented. The second part is the benefits and risk analysis tables. And of course, we're only talking about exploration programs, so there's things like exploration GIDs, geophysics, geochemistry, and all it does is give very simple things. This is an example of the exploration grids table for the social risks and environmental risks. So it goes through and it talks about social benefits, it talks about social risks, it talks about some mitigation opportunities for these different things that happen both on the environmental and on the social activities. I'll just zoom in here on some of the exploration GIDs and some of the things that are listed in here. For example, social benefits. Of course, we all know when you're out there doing exploration, you're filling the hotels many times in the off-season, you're eating in the restaurants, you're buying supplies in local stores. The exploration dollars have significant impact on a lot of the rural communities. Although one of the ladies that's present in the audience pointed out that she lives in a rural area where there are no restaurants and there are no motels, so it's really not going to benefit that for the exploration dollars spent there. But certainly in the local area, it's going to benefit people. Social risk is lack of transparency by the exploration company can result in rumors and gossip on the local information networks. That's really what you need to have to avoid, because there's a lot of misinformation gets circulated on those rumors, and you really want to have to try and fight that. Loss of long-term revenue opportunities if people are cutting trails. If you're cutting a 4-foot wide trail for your exploration grid, which most people probably don't do these days, but they probably used to in the old days, people tend to walk down those things, and they lose a lot of merchantable timber if they cut too big a trees, although most companies today, I think, stick to practices where they reduce the amount of timber they actually cut on the trails. But the grid lines, I don't know, I've certainly worked on enough grid lines in the days in the exploration companies that this time of the year when the hunting season on, it gets quite dangerous on those grid lines because lots of hunters use them as access point because they're nice straight trails that they can shoot down if they happen to see a deer walking down these trails. So they do provide a lot of access to properties that weren't accessible in the past. Just mitigation on some of these, open, transparent communication. Section 3 talks about the mining cycle or sequence, and I always talk about it as a mining sequence because when I think about a mining cycle, I think about something that's going full loop. You're coming back, you have an undisturbed site, you do your mining and you bring it back to an undisturbed site. You can do that, but in the process you may have removed 1 million or a couple million tons of material, so it's not going to look exactly like it did from the start, and there's probably going to be contaminants that are going to be stored on the site. So technically it's really not a cycle, I just talk about it as a sequence. But one of the key things, I give quite a few presentations to councillors and planning and CAO people around the province, and one of the key points I always push towards the students and the councillors is the market demand. Because people tend to forget that they're the ones that are driving the mineral industry. People aren't out there exploring, they aren't out there mining if there isn't a market for those materials. So the first thing that has to be created for us to go and explore is a market. And one of the examples I always use that's created a huge market in recent years, of course, is all the high technology projects. One of the big things that's happening in Nova Scotia is windmills are popping up all over the place. I look at a windmill and I just see a heap full of minerals transformed into a different shape. But it's hard for people to get their head around that. I think people are under the impression that these things pop out of the sky and land on the site and they're up and operating a short period of time. They disconnect from that part where the people actually have to go out and mine it and produce these somewhere in the world. And of course, one of the big things that they use in these windmills is rare earth element magnets. And rare earth element magnets, from my perspective, and I'm probably is in the industry, is that they're one of the most difficult things to mine and probably one of the more hazardous things to mine because a lot of times they're tied up with uranium or thorium. So you end up with radioactive tails. And then you have to use a lot of solvents to separate out those individual minerals in order so they can use in the final production process. Although I noticed on NovaScotia.com today that UCOR has actually developed a new process that's not going to use all the solvents that they use in China. So that's a significant step forward. So I use these arguments when I'm talking to students. And one of the students' classes we put on a couple years ago, or last year, I guess, and we've done it twice, is a partnership with the Land Use Planning School, and it specifically focuses on geology and land use planning in geology, mineral resource development, and land use planning. And we use this example, and a lot of the people are quite surprised by it. One of the other tables that I use in there is one that I modified from a table that was in a BC document. And it shows a triangle here, and it shows the area of impacted land in the early stages of exploration is quite high because you're out there doing reconnaissance exploration, and by the time you get to the mining stage, the area of land that's impacted is really quite small. This is really, it's a good tool to show people in a visual way the impacts. Number 4 is a glossary of technical terms. So we talk about diamond drilling all the way to geochem programs, just to give some basic information and a few pictures so that people can start to understand what these surveys are. Section 5 is some common questions, and when I go out and give these presentations, these are some of the common questions that I face from councillors. Is it a pit or quarry or mine? Like I said, most people don't really know the difference between the two. They don't know there's 2 pieces of legislation that deal with these different activities. So where's the next steps? We've circulated the document internally and to a couple of other people outside. The next step is to complete the final draft, or not final draft, final draft, and get the editing and additions to it. Then we'll circulate it out to the municipal reps that service Nova Scotia. There's 3 municipal reps in the province that look after all the municipal relations. They'll take a look at it, give us some feedback on it. We'll talk to industry folks, circulate it through some of you folks and get some feedback on it. We'll complete the final edits or additions. Then Service Nova Scotia folks are going to take me out around the province to give presentations to the municipal CAOs. And the municipal CAOs are, of course, they're the chief people in the administrative branches of all the municipalities. So they're really the go-to people that people are going to ask questions to. They tend not to go to politicians, where the politicians will just hand the questions off to the CAOs and let them answer the questions. So they really need to be informed about this stuff. We'll post it on the website, and then we'll release some hard copies. And hopefully people are going to start to use it in their communities. But I think there's some real opportunities here to be developed about education work, and I do a lot of education work. And one of the things that I've done is gone around the province and given a presentation that I called Geology and Society. And one of the key things I recognized quite early on is that just in the simple name, when I used to go in and introduce myself and they'd ask who you work for, and I'd say I work for the Mineral Resources Department, Department of Natural Resources, and I've had literally councillors walk up to me, look me in the eye, give a grunt, and walk off in the other direction because they're so anti-mining. So what I started to do is I changed the presentation around, and I actually started off talking about the environmental geology aspects. And I talk about things like karst, I talk about the abandoned mines, I talk about acid rock drainage. And once you go through that presentation, then there's a whole section on mineral resource development. And I'll tell you, by the time you go through that presentation on the environmental geology, people really start to understand that you're also there thinking about their interests, about their health and safety risks, and you're identifying things that they never thought about. And you've won them. You've won them over by the time you get to the middle of that presentation. So when you start talking about mineral resource development, you've won those people over. You've more or less won their trust. And so you can have a rational conversation about mineral resource development. But I can guarantee you in many of the council meetings, if you were to flip those back the other way, some of them councillors may have walked out. There's that much sensitivity in some of these areas. And so I think we really have to think about how we're going to educate people. But there's lots of opportunities, I think, to engage with communities. And one of the opportunities, I think, is that a lot of exploration companies go out and do some very detailed mapping. You guys identify a lot of these areas that are high-risk areas. If you take those when you go and have your community discussions and say, look, we know there's some shafts out here, we'll show you where there's a lot of metals in the environment that could be potentially hazardous when you do developments. So I think those are the kinds of things that you can take to communities, and it'll go a long ways to building trust. So where are we going to be in 18 or 20 years from now? Are we going to be able to put a tick mark through this list? I don't think we will unless we really start to cooperate more fully the way that we're going forward in terms of our education process. I think there's lots of opportunities there to do better cooperation and move ahead. And I would challenge everybody to sit down and have some serious discussions about these opportunities. John Calder identified one yesterday with the geoheritage opportunities. I think that's a good opportunity there to start some dialogue. Thank you.